Hello, my name is Ben Campbell. I'm the event broadcasting and film teacher here at Edmond North.
And my name's Mark Lee. I'm the photography teacher here at Edmond North.
Today we're going to be covering the manual exposure on a Canon T6. So we know this is a super popular camera for our students, and both of our programs have some as well. So we'll show you these techniques on this camera, but obviously they translate to anything in photo and video.
Right, so whether you have a Nikon or you have a Sony, an Olympus, a Minolta, I could go on and on with camera manufacturers, but the same principles will apply. But since most of you have a T6 or a T7 or a T5, somewhere in that range, this will be the operational method, pretty much exactly how you'll want to set your settings and the functions of your camera.
Awesome. Let's hop on the camera and take a look.
Cool. We're going to start off with, I'm looking at 250th of a second. That's my shutter speed, 1/250th. So if you remember your fractions from middle school, I know I don't. I had to learn them all over again when I got into photography. So that's pretty fast. 1/250th of a second is really fast. What that will do is it will stop somebody who's dancing and it'll freeze them in place. Now, if they're dancing, I don't do the modern dances. So if you're dancing really hard and aggressively, 1/250th of a second is not going to stop it. You're looking at about 1/500th of a second to stop somebody who's really getting after it. So right now, though, 1/250th of a second is too dark for the picture that we need to capture in our current lighting situation. So I've got a couple of options here. Actually, I have three. You're always going to have three options on a camera. You've got shutter speed, you've got aperture, and you have ISO. So we're just going to worry about just strictly shutter speed right now. So I'm going to take my little wheel here that's on the top of my camera. This is designated to help me adjust my shutter speed. So I'm going to move that shutter speed and make it slower. So I'm at 1/100th of a second. 1/50th of a second. Now I'm starting to see a little bit of light creep in. And now I'm at 1/5 of a second. And now we're going to go 1 full second. I'm overexposed. So I'm going to go back the other direction. So I'm turning this wheel clockwise and counterclockwise. When I go counterclockwise, I'm slowing my shutter down. When I'm pulling the wheel and going clockwise, I'm speeding my shutter up. So I'm going to go right about there. I get picky. So that's the exposure that I want. Now, if you look right there, I can take a picture. And now that I've focused on this, my camera is trying to focus. It's an automatic focus. And so it takes a little bit of time for your lens to do the work. You can go into manual focus and do it much quicker. But just for this talk today, we're going to talk about automatic focus. So we're letting the camera do the work for us there. Now, if you look at the numbers, the 3, the 2, the 1, the 1, 2, 3, right there in the middle of the bottom of your screen. That's showing the exposure level. And what we want to try to do is put that little line in the center for most time. If you're looking at something that is a medium value, and that means not black, not white, but a medium gray value, it could be blue, it could be green, it doesn't really matter the hue, but if it's a medium value, you want to put that line right there in the middle. Now I happen to be focused on something that is highly reflective. So it's got some light values in it, it's got some dark values in it, and it's got some medium values in it. So I'm just personally looking at how this is affecting visually on my screen, and I'm like, that's the exposure that I want. And you notice that the line is not right there in the middle, it's up 1 stop. So those numbers represent a stop. 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. And if you're close to that, you're probably going to be okay when you take your picture. And there's our shot. So we've got that in focus. We've got our helmet in focus. We're at a pretty slow shutter speed. Now my aperture is the number right next to my shutter speed. My shutter speed is far left on the screen, bottom far left. We're going to go over one to the right, and it says 10. That's my aperture. So my aperture it's actually in the lens, it's not in the camera, but it's like the pupil in your eye. And what happens is when we get really bright light, our pupil closes down and constricts. That protects the nerves and the stuff in our eye so we don't burn our retinas out. When you take that number and you go to a lower number, you're making that pupil dilate or get bigger. So in a dark situation, your eye naturally dilates and gets bigger to let in more light. So on a camera, we can do the same thing. I'm going to take and move. Now on a T6, this is a little tricky. There's a button at the top right portion of the screen. So here's your screen. Top right corner of the screen, there's a button that says AV. Now when you press in the AV button, you've got to hold your thumb on it. Don't let up. You can move the click wheel again, and this time you don't adjust shutter speed, you adjust your aperture. So I'm going to lower my aperture to we're going to go 1.8. Let's go 1.8. Now what that did was it let in more light. So now my picture is overexposed. So now what I have to do is I've got to compensate. I've got to use my brain. That's the most important part of being a photographer. It's not the equipment that you have, it's what's between your ears. So I'm going to take my shutter speed and I'm going to make it faster. So to make it faster, I'm going to push that wheel. I lied. I do this all the time. I'm dyslexic. So I'm going to pull my wheel to the right and I'm going to make it faster. The faster I make it, the less light is going to be allowed to get to the sensor. So we're going to 1/100th of a second. And that's a nice exposure for that particular helmet. Now you notice when I press the button in, my little line there at the bottom, it's not perfectly in the center. It's almost +1. So we're about the equivalent of the last picture we took. And then we take our shot. So I've taken our aperture. One of the things that happens when you lower your aperture is you have a very slender area in which is focus. So lower number aperture, less in focus. Higher number aperture, more is in focus. Also, we use the word f-stop when we talk about aperture. So in your camera, you can read things or watch a video and somebody's talking about f-stop. It goes hand in hand. It's the same thing as aperture. So the next shot we're going to take is with a high aperture. So I'm going to press in my AV button again, hold that in, and I'm going to raise my aperture up to probably, let's go 20 f-stop of 20. So we're right about here. Now my picture gets dark. It's gone. What happened? Well, now I've got to slow my shutter speed down. So I don't have my finger on the AV button. I'm just going to use the click wheel by itself. That's going to operate my shutter speed. So now I'm going to make my shutter speed slower. And as I make it slower, it's going to get lighter. And I'm at 2 seconds, 1 1/6, 1 1/3. If I press my button in, I'm about in the same, that line that pops in the middle is in the same spot again. That's kind of what I want. So then I take my shot. Now we've got a lot of things that are pretty close in proximity to each other in this room. You're going to see a difference when you're outside and you're taking photos of somebody. So say you're taking photos like at a football game and there's a football player right in front of you and there's a football player 50 yards down the field. The person that you're focusing on right in front of you is going to be clearly in focus and the person behind them is going to be blurry. When you raise your aperture to a higher number, you're going to get more in focus, but you're not going to quite get somebody who's 50 yards away in focus as well. You've got to back away from your subjects to get a large group like that in focus. And to talk about depth of field in a short video, oh, that's a whole nother topic today, or a topic for another day. So we're just going to worry about manual controls of shutter and aperture and ISO. So the other way to change how much light you're getting in your picture, we've already talked about shutter speed, we've talked about aperture. Now we're going to talk about ISO. ISO is a way for your camera to help you out. The sensor there in its little computer is going to add artificial light to a scene. Now, that can be tricky because when you get really high in ISO, you start to introduce something called noise. And it's these little specks that really aren't there that kind of creep in, and sometimes they're a bright color, and it makes your photos look, not so good. So my rule of thumb is that I don't go over ISO 400. I try to stay below 400. Now sometimes I have to go above 400 because I have no other choice. If I'm in a dimly lit situation and I don't have a flash and I'm limited by whatever lens I have on the camera, I just have to raise my ISO. Now we're in video mode for instruction purposes today. So there's another way to do this, but you can also do it this way. I'm going to change my ISO for this scene. I'm going to press the Q button next to my screen, and that pulls up some things on the side there on the left side. And I can scroll up and down between those. And I want to go to ISO. Of course, I've got my ISO set at 400 because that's kind of where I like to stay. And I'm going to drop my ISO down to 100. So we're going to go to 100. Now you notice the scene got a little bit darker. Now, when you're at ISO 100 or 200 or 300 or 400, you're not going to see any little noise or little hot pixels that pop in your photo. That's why it's good to stay 400 or below. Just for the sake of kind of showing you what happens when I add a lot of ISO in, I'm going to go back to ISO and I'm going to change it all the way to 6400. And you notice the scene is what we always use this little slang term, it's called blown out. Everything got really bright. So how I can compensate for that is I can change my shutter speed. Again, I'm not touching any buttons, I'm just using the click wheel, and I'm going to make my shutter speed not much faster, but faster. So I'm at 1/20th of a second. It's a little faster. It's opening for a less period of time. My f-stop's at 20, or my aperture is at 20. So if I want to change my aperture, I can press my AV, and I can flick my aperture down to, let's just say, a reasonable aperture 7.1. So now my shutter speed, let off all the buttons. I'm going to increase my shutter speed to, 1/100th. That's good. You're not going to get any blur with 1/100th of a second, especially if you're hand holding a camera, and most of us do. We don't walk around with a tripod. So if you're hand holding your camera, your shutter speed needs to be at least match the focal length of your lens. This happens to be a 50mm lens. My shutter speed needs to be 1/50th or higher. So 1/50th, 1/60th, 1/100th, 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, 1/4000th, 1/8000th. I think I named them all. Those are your faster shutter speeds. When you go lower than 1/50th, when you're at 1/20th, 1/10th, a half a second, even if you try to hold that camera really still, you're most likely going to blur that picture. So that's when you need a tripod. So if we take this picture, I just wanted to press the button to see where my little marker was, and it's a little bit right of center near that 1, because that's the exposure that I like. That's what we get every time. So hope you've learned a little bit about ISO and a little bit about shutter speed and a little bit about aperture. And if you ever have a question about it, feel free to email me. I'm always available. Or you can come by the classroom. I'm in East 281. And I would be glad to talk with you about that.
All right, so to switch gears a little bit and talk about these same concepts for video. Basically everything that Mr. Lee just went over is exactly the same for video, the way that that relationship between your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO work. However, with video, we have a couple of these decisions already made for us. Some of those things are locked in, most notably your shutter speed. So for video, you also have something called a frame rate, which is back to the days of actually filming movies on film, how fast that film was going through your camera. So the standard that they came up with was 24 frames per second. So since you're locked in at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed is supposed to be double that. So I've actually got it at 50 frames per second here for my shutter speed now, but so just a little off. But that relationship should be about should be twice what your frame rate is. So you can change your frame rate for certain things, like for sports, you might want to film at 60 frames per second because you've got a lot of motion. And the noticeable difference between that 24 or 60 frames per second is your motion blur. So like how much as I'm waving my hand at the camera. That's what looks pretty natural to your eye. So I'm gonna have Mr. Lee step in here and just wave at us. So right now we're at 30 frames per second. So you can see how his hand is blurry, but it's a pretty natural. It won't let us go any slower than that because we're filming video. It knows that it's gonna look pretty bad if we slow that frame rate down, or if we should slow that shutter speed down any more than that. So I'm gonna put it back again at 50 frames per second, and again kind of just adjust my aperture to get that more properly exposed. And yeah, let's get another wave right quick. So you can see that's a really natural look for like what your eye actually sees when you're waving your hand in front of yourself. And then we'll do it one more time, and I'm gonna speed this up a whole bunch so that I'm basically filming at 200th at a at a shutter speed of 200. So again, getting properly exposed, and then get that back in focus. All right, and then one more wave. So yeah, you can see how, since it's so fast, it looks fake. That's not what your hand looks like to your actual eye. That's kind of how that relationship is working with your frame rate and your shutter speed. So since I'm locked in at 50 frames per second on that, now I have to set my exposure only using my aperture and my ISO. So right now I've got my aperture at 3.5, which, as you can see from this shot, has this helmet is properly exposed and is in focus, and then in the back of the shot you can see the succulents and stuff on this bookshelf are not in focus. So if that's something that people are commonly going for in film, you want to have that like blurry background, it's a real cinematic look. So if you want to change that, if you want to make that more dramatic even, what I'll do is I will change my aperture to 1.8, and now you can see my shot is very overexposed. So if you're going for that real blurred out look, you're already locked in on your aperture and for your shutter speed. So the only thing that's left is your ISO. So for us, I'll go ahead and make that change real quick. So again, coming into this menu, I can go down to 100, and that looks pretty good for our use if you were filming something here. So as a opposite example of, again, taking a look at the ISO, since this is something that is your main form of control of your exposure when you're doing video, it would be pretty common that you'll be tempted to keep your other settings as they are, and then just be changing your ISO, jack that up real high so that if you're trying to get more of your shot in focus, you want to change that aperture to have both the helmet and the stuff on the bookshelf behind it in focus. So I'm gonna do an attempt at that real quick. So I'll go ahead and change my aperture, make that something a lot higher, like maybe 16. So obviously my shot now is very underexposed, so you might be tempted to just lift your ISO, and these cameras will let you go all the way up to 6400, but you can definitely see that grain at this level, so not the look that we're going for. So again, if you're in that creative situation, you've kind of got some new constraints and you got to figure out what you want to do with that. So for me, that's probably going to result in me just changing my aperture more to something that allows me to keep that ISO down at a lower, more acceptable level. With that relationship as well, one of the things we talk about is whenever you're outside, your ISO only goes down to 100, and because your frame rate is locked in, you can't have a really fast shutter speed to close down, to close out some of that light. You're gonna be letting in a bunch of light. So we have something called an ND filter, which is basically like sunglasses for your camera. I'll make some other content about how to use that, but basically if your shot is already so bright because you're outside and all your other things are locked in, that's one more trick that you have in your bag so that you can get your shot properly exposed.
Now, what me and Mr. Campbell have shared with you today is a general rule. It's going to work for most every situation and most every camera that you encounter or use. However, when you have different cameras, they have different capabilities, and some cameras can have a much higher f-stop, some cameras can have much higher ISO. So everything is there's always an exception to the rule. So hopefully in the future, we're going to cover some of these different types of lenses and different types of camera models and show you how they have some special rules. So for me, I'm signing out today and knocking over laptops. So for me today, I'm going to sign out and let Mr. Campbell close with his wonderful comments.
Thank you. So really the best way that you can learn this skill is just by doing it. You've got 3 variables that change your shot dramatically, and anytime you move one of them, you have to move one or both of the other 2. So it's really a relationship that you just have to toy around with to figure out. And hopefully you'll get out there and start trying this and really start improving your knowledge of your camera and improving your work as well. So with that, we'll say goodbye. And as I always like to say, it doesn't matter if it's perfect, it only matters that you start.